Here's something that tells you a lot about Donald Trump. The people sounding the alarm the loudest about him are the people who have worked most closely with him. That's always a bad sign. And today, the Washington Post reported on the frustration among many former Trump aides who have been trying to warn voters about the dangers of electing him again. Cassie Hutchinson just mentioned this story, and I want to just drill down on it because it's such an interesting one people should read. Josh Jossi writes in that story, quote, "So far, Trump has surged toward the GOP nomination, even as former aides critical of him have blanketed the airwaves, giving scathing speeches, testifying on camera in front of congressional committees, and penning books, shaking off the kinds of condemnations that could mortally wound another politician in almost any other presidential year." Jossi interviewed 16 former Trump advisors and found, quote, they are grappling with how they can puncture Trump's candidacy in 2024, whether they can or should coordinate with one another, and whether their voices will even matter. Back with me is former Trump White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson. So this story has so much in it, including it quotes Trump's former White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who, of course, had the same job that your former boss, Mark Meadows, had. And Kelly said in this story, I'm going to read it, "What's going on in the country that a single person thinks that this guy would be still a good president when he said the things he said and done the things he's done? It's beyond my comprehension. He has the support he has." Do you have similar feelings of surprise of the level of support Trump still has out there?
I do and I don't. You know, there is a massive constituency of Trump voters that were never going to change their minds. I think that it is sad that we haven't changed a larger swath of the population's minds, and we have to think about that as we approach the election in 2024. Donald Trump showed us who he was in 2016 when he went down the escalator in Trump Tower in New York City. I admit that I was blinded to a lot of his faults. You know, I write a lot in my book. My book is full of unflattering truths and things that I wish that I could change about my past. But I think what's important now is that I have the role that I have the hindsight that I have, and I want to be able to continue calling attention to this. Because with the hindsight that I have, there's no reason that he should have been elected in 2016. There's no reason that the election in 2020 should have been close, and that's coming from somebody who worked for him until January 20th, 2021. But when we think about this next election, we need to change the tone of the conversation, because
what do you mean by that?
Because in my view, at least, talking at people or continuing to harp on his so-called character flaws. Sometimes that, in my opinion, and from what I have experienced, that sort of drills people in more to their support of him. They get more defensive over him, and I know that because that's how I used to feel. It wasn't really until, you know, I went through the trials with the committee the first few times and eventually switched legal counsel from Trump-funded legal counsel to my own independent legal counsel. And it wasn't really until I retained my own independent legal counsel, when I was finally free of everything Trump world, where my horizon began to open, and I felt that I wasn't being talked at. I felt that not only my lawyers, but members on the January 6th committee, at that point, I had a lot of faults. I had made a lot of mistakes, but people had listened to me, and people helped me get to the point where I'm at now, where I see it clearly. I see that he is a dangerous man. I see that he has severe character flaws, but those character flaws go one step further. His character flaws make him uniquely unsuited for the office of the presidency and should be nowhere near the Oval Office ever again.
So you have, as you just said, you've gone through this journey over the last several years, which has not been an easy one. And I think what you touched on there is that people don't like to be talked at, who may be his supporters. So what do you think the argument, you know, there's a lot of people watching out there who are wondering, like, how do we bring Trump supporters over and say this guy is scary, he's dangerous? What is the argument that should be made?
You know, I wish that I had the keys to the kingdom on that, because I think we would be in a much better place. I think there's a few things, Jen. And in the Washington Post article, there's a quote from General Kelly, who I think is an American patriot. He has served his country in many capacities, and I think phenomenal man and public servant. But there's a quote, and I am paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of, he spoke out about what Trump had said about members of the military.
Yeah.
And it was about a half-a-day news story. What I say to something like that, in my experience, is you can't just talk once. And the media is a very useful tool, but we need to be able to expand our horizons and expand the way that we're communicating with people.
Yeah.
Because saying something once doesn't create change. We need to have conversations with people, and sometimes they're smaller conversations. Sometimes we need to go into swing states and have conversations with people, because the media can only reach so far.
Yeah, neighbor to neighbor is often very powerful, most powerful. Dossie also writes in his story, which I thought was interesting and maybe is going to alarm some Democrats out there, that, well, many of these aides he spoke with don't want Trump to be president again. They are loath to be viewed as helping a Democrat, and that, you know, members of this group, including former Attorney General Bill Barr, have argued Trump is both unfit, of course, to serve, has probably committed crimes, but they may still vote for him over a Democrat. Is that what you're hearing from former aides, some who have spoken out and some who have not?
Well, to be completely candid, I don't often speak with any of my former colleagues, but from what I read and from articles like this, and also from my experience, there was a point that I felt that way too. I'm not proud of that. But what I will say to that too, though, is that is an egregious form of partisanship. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump isn't a Republican, and yes, maybe by name he considers himself a Republican, but Donald Trump cares more about authoritarian rule than he does our rule of law.
Yeah.
He doesn't care about preserving our Constitution. He cares about leveraging it for his own power and his own gain. So when we look at this next election, we need to think about, if we want our democracy to survive, who do we elect that we can put in the Oval Office that has the character, integrity, and grit to be able to carry our country through this moment in time. And that person isn't Donald Trump.
Well, as you've said, he's likely the nominee. I know you've been reluctant to say who you're going to vote for, but are you leaving the door open to voting for Joe Biden if it's between the two of them?
I will say my door is completely shut to voting for Donald Trump. And the only reason that I will not endorse a candidate right now is because I still am hopeful that Donald Trump does not end up being the nominee next year. I think our country will be in a much better place overall, not just for myself, but the ticket and the future of our country will be. But what I will say too, though, is I think everybody should vote for Joe Biden if they want our democracy to survive.
That's